In this chapter, we'll discuss the risk factors for Parkinson's disease. Now, while some of these might seem like they could be a potential cause, and they are, that's why they increase the risk. However, we still don't actually know what causes Parkinson's disease. So in your assignment, when I ask you what causes Parkinson's disease, I want the underlying cause we discussed in the last video, that there's dopamine cell loss in the substantia nigra. So the first risk factor we're going to discuss is genetics. And in order to look at the genetic component of Parkinson's disease, we have to look at something called heritability. Now, heritability is the percentage of variation in a trait that can be due to genetics. So here we're talking about Parkinson's. So how much variation, when you look at the population of who gets Parkinson's disease, can be attributed to genetic factors. And when we look at Parkinson's disease, and we saw this also with Alzheimer's disease, we have an early onset and a late onset. And so the early onset Parkinson's disease, which is before the age of 50, which is what Michael J. Fox, if you've heard of him, that's what he had, early onset Parkinson's disease. And that really seems to have a strong genetic link to it. However, late onset Parkinson's disease, which is after the age of 50, which again, like Alzheimer's, increases, the risk increases the older we get. There are some genes that contribute, but even if you have an identical twin, you're not really any more likely to get it than if you had a brother or sister that had Parkinson's disease. So it suggests kind of a very weak genetic link, so probably more some sort of environmental influence for that late onset Parkinson's disease. So what could some of these potential environmental causes be? Exposure to toxins, we know, increases risk. So as you saw in the video, or you will see in the case of the frozen addicts, the drug that they were exposed to was MPTP. So that's again what they thought they were taking heroin, but yet the person accidentally made MPTP, and they ended up having instantaneous symptoms of Parkinson's disease, advanced Parkinson's disease. So as they mentioned in the case of the frozen addicts, MPTP has a similar chemical structure to some pesticides and herbicides. And that's what this is showing you. So here's MPTP. This is what it's converted into in its toxic form, MPP+. And you can see it's very similar to paraquat, which is found in herbicides and pesticides. We know that farmers and others that have exposure to these toxins have an increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And so like my father-in-law, I've told you before, he has Parkinson's disease, and he was a golf pro. So he was on the tour, and then after he did the regular tour, and then he did the senior tour, and then afterwards he was a golf pro at different golf courses around the West Coast. And so how do you think they keep those lawns, or those greens, very green, right? By using pesticides and herbicides to keep them in their pristine shape. And so although I don't know that that's what, caused his Parkinson's disease, it kind of seems to be a good potential reason. So in terms of these environmental influences, how are they killing the neurons? How could they be toxic to the neurons? So I believe they said a little bit about it in the case of the frozen addicts, but the basic and what I want you to understand is that they damage the mitochondria. And remember, we said earlier in the semester, the mitochondria are the powerhouses of the neurons, right? They provide the energy for all of our cells. So if neurons or mitochondria are damaged, then the neurons are going to suffer. And so here, this is just showing you what happens is with MPTP, is MPTP goes through the blood-brain barrier, and then an enzyme that we have for dopamine, MAOB, monoamine oxidase, converts that MPTP into an active form, the MPP+, that then can go into a cell via the dopamine transporter because it looks like dopamine, and now it can go and cause damage to the mitochondria, and also creates reactive oxygen species, which are also not good for the neurons. Both ultimately lead to cell death. Another potential way that these toxins are killing neurons is by causing proteins to aggregate, much like we saw in Alzheimer's disease. So here it's a different protein. It's called alpha-synuclein, and it clumps to form what we call Lewy bodies. So here's just showing you, it's just kind of a more recent article that talks about in order to understand the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease, is here we have the normal alpha-synuclein. And what we see in people with Parkinson's disease or Lewy body disease, that protein destabilizes and it aggregates or groups together, and so it forms these little clumps, and this is what it looks like here. And again, it's just kind of gunking up the brain. All right, so here's a diagram that's just showing you the progression of Parkinson's disease and then Parkinson's disease with dementia, which also sometimes people classify as Lewy body disease. So here the person is preclinical, okay, and you can see that they already have some of this alpha-synuclein, and maybe that's what's killing those dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra. That these disease starts to progress, and you can see here about 10, 15 years in, we start to see some of those Lewy bodies, that alpha-synuclein protein clumping in the cortex. And it isn't until we have this widespread Lewy bodies throughout the cortex that we start to see dementia in someone with your typical Parkinson's disease. If a person lives this long, they typically will get the dementia, but you can see it's a good 20 to 25 year process typically. Now, in Parkinson's disease with dementia, here the person's preclinical, but they already have those Lewy bodies in the cortex. So preclinical means that they don't have any symptoms yet. Now, at let's say age 67, they get diagnosed, and then less than 5 years later, they already have the dementia because they have these widespread Lewy bodies clumping in the cortex. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes people would classify this as Lewy body disease. I had a friend whose father was diagnosed fairly young, so I think it was probably before he was 50. He might have just been 50, so I'm not sure if they considered him early onset or late onset Parkinson's disease. And at first they said he just had something called Parkinsonism because he just had tremors and then he would freeze. But his progression didn't follow this typical 20 to 25 years. Within 5 years, he had severe dementia. He was, wheelchair bound. He, basically looked like he had advanced Parkinson's disease, and he didn't remember things. Just like someone with Alzheimer's disease, he had periods of lucidity and then times where he just didn't remember anything. And so ultimately, he first didn't get the right medication right away because they diagnosed him wrong. Then they changed the diagnosis to Parkinson's disease. And then by the end, they really said he probably did have, they call it Lewy body dementia. Or sometimes people refer to it as Parkinson's disease with dementia, and sometimes people do split the two into different diagnostic categories.